Exploring Stories, Barney and Betty Hill. On a quiet night around 10:30 p.m. on September 19th, 1961, Betty and Barney Hill were driving back home to Portsmouth from a vacation in Canada around Niagara Falls in Montreal. They were traveling south of Lancaster, New Hampshire. Betty then noticed a bright point of light in the sky. It moved erratically, from below the moon and the planet Jupiter, heading to the west of the moon. As Barney Hill navigated the US Route 3, Betty initially thought she was observing a falling star, but the light moved upwards instead of down. Betty began to feel intrigued and slightly unsettled by the erratic movements of the light, which seemed to only grow bigger and brighter. Betty urged Barney to stop the car for a closer look and to walk their dog Delcy, who had now become restless. Barney pulled over at a scenic picnic area just south of the Twin Mountain. Now, to be honest, the Hills have already committed a cardinal sin of any horror movie, in that when something spooky is going on, you don't stop the car, you keep going. Well, Betty retrieved a pair of binoculars and observed an odd-shaped craft, flashing multicolored lights as it traveled across the face of the moon. This piqued her curiosity, recalling how her sister had claimed to see a flying saucer years earlier. Betty wondered if she was witnessing something similar. Barney, skeptical at first, used the binoculars and initially thought the craft was a commercial airliner heading towards Vermont on its way to Montreal. However, when the craft began to move erratically and rapidly descended in their direction without appearing to turn, Barney realized that this object that he thought was a plane was definitely not a plane. The Hills then collected their dog and hurried into their car. They began driving down the road, about a mile south of the Indian Head. The object rapidly descended towards their vehicle, prompting Barney to stop in the middle of the highway. The enormous silent craft hovered about 80 to 100 feet above their 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, filling the entire field of view through the windshield. To Barney, it resembled a huge pancake. With a pistol in his pocket for protection, he stepped away from his vehicle and moved closer to the object. Again, one of the cardinal sins to do in a horror situation. Using his binoculars, Barney saw about 8 to 11 humanoid figures peering out of the craft window, seemingly looking directly at him. Betty was still in the car, and she was absolutely fear-struck by what she was seeing. She began shouting to Barney to return to the vehicle. Suddenly, all but one of the figures moved away from the window. The only figure remaining continued to stare at Barney, communicating a message to him that he could only describe came to him in his brain, telling him to stay where you are and keep looking. Barney noted that the humanoid forms were wearing glossy black uniforms and black caps. Red lights on bat-wing-like fins began to extend from the side of the craft, and a long structure descended from its bottom. The silent craft approached to within 50 to 80 feet overhead and 300 feet away from Barney. And what happened next will shock you. Nothing. The aircraft flew away, leaving them stunned. Mr. Hill got back in the car and drove home. They drove home about dawn. The Hills felt a lingering sense of unease. There were odd sensations and impulses that they couldn't readily explain. They remembered everything, at least, they thought. Betty, for instance, insisted that their luggage be kept near the back door rather than being brought into the main part of the house. Their watches, once reliable and used often, had inexplicably stopped working. Barney noticed that the leather strap of his binoculars were now torn and broken. Though he couldn't remember how it happened, he had just used them. The toes of his best-dressed shoes were now scuffed and scraped. An inexplicable urge compelled Barney to examine his genitals in the bathroom, though he found nothing unusual. They looked normal. They both took long showers, hoping to remove any possible contamination from their strange encounter. They felt as though their skin felt weird. Afterwards, they each drew pictures of what they had observed that night. Something else started happening. They started hearing a buzzing noise in their head. They'd cupped their ears to see if there was noise happening in the house, but no. It was as if the noise was coming from inside their brain. They were perplexed and disoriented. The Hills tried to piece together the sequence of events from their UFO sighting and the drive home. Yet their memories after hearing the buzzing sounds were beginning to fragment and becoming incomplete. After sleeping for a few hours, Betty awoke and placed her shoes and her clothing she had worn during the encounter into the closet. She noticed that her dress was torn at the hem, zipper, and lining. Later, when she retrieved the dress, she observed a pinkish powder on it. She hung the dress on her clotheslines, and the powder blew away in the breeze. But the dress remained irreparably damaged. Although she initially threw away the dress, she changed her mind and she retrieved it, feeling as though it may have some value later on. She hung it back into her closet. Over the years, 5 laboratories have conducted chemical and forensic analysis on the dress, seeking answers. I found it extremely interesting that the wiki article failed to mention any of the analysis summary for the pink dye or pink dust that was on the dress that was placed on them during the encounter. However, I managed to find an analysis summary. The analysis summary indicates there is no unknown DNA on it, and it looks like there was a high concentration of mildew in the pink areas, which would have been applied from over the years of not touching the dress and it just sitting in a closet. It also looks like there was trace DNA of human, spider, and possibly mouse and bovine DNA, as well as soil bacteria. But to say that there was alien DNA or unknown DNA, the analysis shows that's not true. Now, the only thing that I could think of is what would be that pink dust is referencing back to maybe your elementary school or when you were in kindergarten. When a kid would throw up, they'd throw some pink dust on it that smelled really bad. That was meant to clean up or disinfect. Maybe at that situation they were attempting to disinfect her so they wouldn't have, a Christopher Columbus indigenous kind of situation. But let's keep reading through the article. In addition to these personal anomalies, they discovered shiny concentric circles on their car's trunk that hadn't been there the previous day. Intrigued and mystified, Betty and Barney began experimenting, seeing if they could do anything to provoke anything. When they touched a compass, they had noticed that when they brought it to the spots on the car, it began whirling rapidly. But when they moved it a few inches away from those spots, the needle would drop down and behave normally. These strange phenomena added layers to their already baffling experience, deepening the mystery of what had transpired that night. And after the whole situation, the Hills kept quiet. That was until October 21st, 1961, in which they filed a report to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, also known as NICAP, which I'll be referring to as NICAP for the rest of the video. NICAP investigator Walter Webb took them seriously. He was a Boston astronomer, and he met with the Hills on the same day they made the report to conduct a 6-hour interview. During that interview, the Hills related all they could remember of the UFO encounter. Barney stated that he had developed some sort of mental block and that he suspected there were portions of the event that he did not wish to remember. He described in detail all that he could remember about the craft and the appearance of the somehow not human figures aboard it. Webb stated that they were definitely telling the truth, and the incident probably occurred exactly as reported, except for some minor uncertainties and technicalities that must be tolerated in any such observation where human judgment is involved. Now, for you people out there, that would be the exact time, the length of the visibility of the craft, the apparent size of the object, the distance, etc. Missing time is a frequent phenomena reported by individuals who claim to be victims of alien abductions. Just like its name states, missing times is entire periods where an individual doesn't remember memories, moments, times. It's essentially the equivalent of getting blackout drunk without the fun. The investigators probed the Hills on the missing time, but they honestly had no recollection. All they could say was they both claimed to recall an image of a fiery orb sitting on the ground. That really didn't help anyone. Betty and Barney resonated that it must have been the moon, but Hoffman and Jackson informed them that the moon had actually set earlier that evening. This is when the subject of hypnosis came up, and it was decided that it should be carried out in order to recover or attempt to recover previously irretrievable memories. Barney was definitely apprehensive, but thought it might help Betty put to rest what Barney described as the nonsense about her dreams. So, this is where we get into what I find is the most interesting part of this entire story, the hypnosis sessions. First, we're going to start with Barney's hypnosis session. Under hypnosis with Dr. Benjamin Simons, as was consistent with his conscious recall, Barney reported that the binocular strap had broken when he ran from the UFO back to his car. He recalled driving the car away from the UFO, but afterward, he felt irresistibly compelled to pull off the road and drive back into the woods, which he did. After getting out of the car, he sighted 6 men standing on the dirt road. The car then began to stall and stop. The 3 men began to approach him in his vehicle. The 6 beings began to move towards Barney and Betty's car. As they began to get closer, Barney realized they were definitely not human. Too skinny, too small, too gray, their eyes different, their face lacking a nose. Barney described the beings as generally similar to what Betty had described. He said the beings stared into his eyes with a terrifying, mesmerizing effect. And while under hypnosis, Barney said, "Those eyes, they're in my brain. I was told to close my eyes because I saw 2 eyes coming close to mine, and I felt like their eyes had been pushed into my eyes. All I see are these eyes. I'm not even afraid that they're not connected to a body. They're just there. They're just so close, pressing against my eyes." While Betty reported a conversation with the leader in English, Barney said that he heard them speaking in a mumble language he did not understand. Betty also mentioned this detail in her recollection. The few times they communicated with him, Barney said it seemed to be through thought transference. When he had given this detail, he was unaware of the word telepathy. Next, we move to Betty's hypnosis session. Under hypnosis, Betty's account was similar to her 5 dreams about the UFO abduction, with some notable differences, mainly pertaining to her capture and release. Her arms were bound behind her back, she was kicking, screaming, and she was fighting off about 3 to 4 4-foot-tall gray men. The technology on the craft was different. The short men differed significantly in physical appearance, and the sequential order of the abduction differed as well. Barney's and Betty's memories of hypnotic regression were, however, consistent with one another. Betty claims that they attempted to remove her dress to examine her and were trying to put on a pink powder. Now, in this story, I'm not trying to debunk the Hills or go into any of the evidence that came out against them. I'm just trying to tell a good story. And what builds off this good story was Marjorie Fish, an Oak Harbor, Ohio elementary school teacher and an amateur astronomer. Intrigued by the Fuller's book on what had occurred, she decided to decipher the star system that was inside the book. Essentially, in the book, Betty Hill had claimed that she had seen a map pertaining to where the aliens came from. Miss Marjorie Fish then began deciphering, assuming that one of the 15 stars on the map must represent Earth's sun. Fish constructed a 3-dimensional model of nearby sun-like stars, using thread and beads, basing stellar distances on those published in 1969 Gliese Star Catalog. Studying thousands of vantage points over 7 years, the only one that seemed to match the Hills map was from a viewpoint of the double star system Zeta Reteculi. And that brings us to the end of this story. The Hills alien abduction is considered one of the most popular and common and famous stories in the alien abduction community. It is to be noted, however, that people like Carl Sagan have come out and said that the star map is nothing more than a random alignment of chance points that ended up creating a solar system. But hey, that doesn't make a really good story, does it? So, if this is the type of content that interests you, please let me know down in the comments below. Thank you so much for your time, and you have a great rest of your night.